Welcome to the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, a series of educational podcasts that showcase the connection between human capabilities and good work design, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia. Hi, I'm Sharon Todd, a certified professional ergonomist and the current president of the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia. In this podcast, Thom Loveday and I are discussing the various human factors projects he has been involved with and the role of human factors in critical systems. Thomas Loveday is a multi-specialist with extensive experience in providing advice on human-centred design to drive innovation, improve user experience, manage human factors and shape organisational behaviour. Much of his career has been spent in high-risk, high-consequence industries, demonstrating a high level of rigour and robustness in his work. Firstly, thank you for joining us on the podcast today. And it's really great to be chatting with you because you've got such a broad experience across so many industries. So how did you become interested in human factors?
There's probably a few drivers sort of happen simultaneously. I actually was aware of human factors as a discipline probably quite early, around 17, 18, because a friend of mine's father, Rick Sellers, was actually a human factors investigator for the Australian Navy. Growing up in a Navy town from which actually a lot of the people involved in the Sea King air crash lived, I was kind of aware, I guess, of the potential for harm in aviation as a result of crashes and that human factors as a contributor. And in addition to that, I became increasingly obsessed with the show Seconds from Disaster. So that used to have a little countdown timer, working backwards from, this mudslide destroyed a village and going back to what was the root cause. And I think that I sort of picked up that, it's interesting how often it was someone didn't take down a container or they didn't weld something, or there was a switch not clicked or a button not recognised, and then they get some guy there talking about, why didn't the person do that? And it was, this person labelled a human factors specialist, and I thought, that would be a really interesting job to have. And I thought initially I'd like to be some form of, disaster investigator. I guess it's kind of a morbid thing to decide at 17 or 18, but I guess here we are, 20 plus years later.
Yeah, and are you morbid?
I think I have to accept that I am.
It sounds like a great beginning. I used to watch that show as well. So your interest in human factors, where has that led you?
So it's been, I found it to be a really fulfilling career. I am someone who probably craves variety. I love learning. I love learning about things. I have a very strong natural curiosity, I guess. And, in the human factors space, I literally get paid to go and understand how people do their jobs and, learn all these weird and wonderful things. So I'll go to motorway control rooms and see people, how they monitor traffic and keep the traffic moving, or I'll go to a surgical theatre and watch people in a hospital, watch these surgeons and the nurses and the anaesthetists all working together to, one, keep a person who's literally open on a table alive, and then two, do a complex precision task on the human body. Or, maybe it's something even more mundane. I've been learning a lot about cycleways recently, and I don't know that I want to be the cycleway expert, but I'm really enjoying learning about what makes for a good cycleway. So I think that, for me, the real benefit of this career has been this variety and opportunity to learn about all these different new and weird and wonderful areas.
So what are some of the projects that you've worked on as an HF professional?
Look, most of my career has been spent in the healthcare sector, particularly over the last 10 years. That said, I have deliberately rotated myself out into other sectors, partly because I have this view that I'm a better healthcare human factors specialist because I can bring an understanding of how they manage HF issues in other sectors to the health industry. Actually, probably a little bit vice versa as well, because although sometimes health feels like the redheaded stepchild of the human factors world, it actually, there are some things like analytics that healthcare does very well, probably almost better than any other sector. Now, in terms of projects themselves, I've worked on some large motorway projects. So I worked on West Connect Stage 3A and did a lot of work around, long tunnel design because that roadway had 27 kilometres of tunnel. I did, the control rooms. I've done rail control projects, and actually for a while I was doing a lot of control room work. I've ridden trains out into the Nullarbor, doing observations of two-driver operations in locos. I've had the opportunity to do a lot of healthcare work, everything from reviewing safety management systems and developing, organisational structural interventions, right down to really detailed analyses of, single form paper forms or a single interface on a digital product. I probably left this out, but I did actually start my career in banking user experience when I was 23. So my first consulting job was actually working on, I'd still say it was applications of human factors, because back then we didn't call it user experience. We were still calling it human-computer interaction or information architecture. But, a lot of using the same human factors approaches to drive certain consumer behaviours. So, very different application, but strangely one I've found very useful in the long term, because it does apply to a lot of different types of digital human-machine interaction-based problems.
Wow. So let's go back. Firstly, you said analytics in health. So let's jump back there for a second. So what does health do well with analytics? What kind of analytics?
I joke that health is amazing at counting things and not so good about necessarily acting on those numbers. I am being a little bit facetious, but the health system, given the seriousness of the work, the education level of the workforce as well is probably a relevant factor. Noting nurses and doctors by default will have degrees, and they're the most common types of roles in health. They're very interested in empirical evidence. So, if you're having a discussion about a HF intervention, they're going to be asking you about the numbers behind it, right? So there's actually a behavioural aspect to, why I think health does analytics well. But the second part to that is that they actually historically have collected a lot of data about patients. And then there's a lot of really innovative work around how to utilise that data. And I've seen some very impressive emerging technologies around digital twin, where they're very seriously talking about providing nurse unit managers with tools that can run a simulation of the hospital's patient flow. And she can then look at whether she should open an additional bed in her ward and whether that will reduce the bottleneck in ED. I look at that and then, to be honest, compare that to some of the population movement work done by the transport sector, and it feels comparatively not sophisticated, though of course there are some pretty amazing things happening in the timetabling space as well. So but I do think health is really doing some impressive work on that.
So let's talk about the digital twin scenario. How does that work?
The digital twin concept is, at least from a government perspective, is that there's a lot of data that's collected up about citizens, right? Literally through the census, but more and more there's just routine data being collected through their interactions with government. In the case of a hospital, we will know a lot about the individual's health, right? I don't think that shouldn't be shocking, should it? We do have a health record. We review it when a patient's being treated, but it tells us a lot about what they're likely to be presenting with, how long they're going to be there for, what sort of care are they going to need. And some of the predictors of that will be things like age, acuity, existing chronic conditions. And so if you pull back and look at that at a population level, if we take that health record and call it a digital twin, we can run a simulation of that individual and their likely care trajectory within a facility or a health district or within the state system. And then if we do that 1 million times over for the entire population, you can start looking at some really amazing things like, should we build a hospital in Dunedoo? Should we build a hospital in Dunedoo given what we know about the demographics of the population? Now, that said, that's not new, right? That's actually how they've always decided where to build a hospital. They'll look at the census and go, well, there's a lot of young families here, so we should build a maternity unit. But the digital twin concept takes that to the next level because it's live data in effect, and it's a lot more detailed and nuanced, and it's actually simulating the individual.
So how does, because you were talking about an RN, maybe an award or ED or whatever, can use this digital twin scenario and then reduce backlog? How? Just tell me about that.
I'll pull back and talk about urban planning because I think it's easier to understand, right? If you think about, and this isn't being facetious, what they're developing at the moment is tooling that operates not dissimilarly to SimCity, right? So it's actually often literally built on video game engines. And what they're doing is taking that entire population data and then they're using it, simulating it through a video game engine to actually show, well, what would be the movements of that population through a transport network on a Tuesday morning in the middle of the year, right? And so they're actually then able to model where should transport routes be uplifted, right? And this is actually New South Wales government's doing that right now. There's an urban planning portal. You can go to their website. It's publicly available, right? With the nurse, what they're doing is actually the tooling I've seen is it's basically it is a video game mock-up. It's in a video game engine. It is a hospital, and then there's actors. So there's literally a patient that walks around, and you can zoom in and zoom out in this 3D model, and that patient has data points, and that basically allows that simulation to understand where are they likely to move in various points in time at the hospital on average, right? And so when the nurse then goes into this simulation and she opens up 2 beds, that bed's now available. So the ED transfers a patient to her bed and the simulation runs again and it shows, well, does the ED now start being able to get through its patient load because they don't have that patient in the ED anymore? Maybe she opens 3 more beds and suddenly the bottleneck is popped and the ED starts flowing more smoothly. So, look, believe me, the technology behind this is phenomenally complex and I don't understand it. And I'm trying to answer these questions as someone who's really interested in the technology in a sense of very impressing emerging uses of it. But personally, there's some really good statisticians in New South Wales right now that are doing, probably provide more detailed answers around what exactly mathematically is going on to enable that tech.
That is amazing. However, I didn't realise that they could do that. So is this something that, is this actually happening a lot? I know obviously it can happen, but is it happening?
It's an emerging tech. So they're building a simulation right now. I think it's for Blacktown Hospital. So this is Western Sydney Local Health District, I believe. And so they're doing that at the moment as a proof of concept, right? Presumably, if it works well, they'll scale it. And if it doesn't work well, they'll refine it or discontinue the project. I'd be hesitant to say where it'll end up. But that said, the urban planning use cases for this tech does exist and is publicly available on New South Wales government portals. So you can actually go and play with it if you're a bit of a data nerd. I feel like I should explain why is a HF practitioner worrying about digital twin? Look, it's because of the use cases in that potentially it would be used to support clinical decision-making by individuals in units. And if you think about human factors' broader purpose of not just eliminating error, but actually achieving process efficiency, that sort of technology and the way that it's utilised by the human decision maker is potentially a game changer, right? Could really sort of resolve some long-standing problems in the healthcare sector, but that's only if the human operator makes different decisions when they have access to that tool. So there's really basic HF things like, okay, you give them a tool. We've given them tools before and they never use it, so it doesn't produce any outcome. Then we get them to use it. Do they understand what it's saying, right? Because they might run the simulation and think, oh, I should open the bed, and actually the simulation's saying the opposite. So there's all these human factors, issues that also need to be thought through around what changes in decision-making would occur once they're given this new tool set.
And that's based on the understanding of the user.
Absolutely. And are they actually worried about bed block in the ED? The first question in that example I've given. I would hope so, but it may not be their primary goal, right? They might be actually making the decision. There might be some fundamentally different reason they're making the decisions they're making, in which case that tool may not be useful at all.
Yes. Obviously, you were involved in numerous projects, and I want to come back to some of them, but I want to jump to the Health Prototyping Centre, because I know that that was one of the last projects possibly that you were working on. Nice little YouTube video that you've done on that. Just want to talk about that, because this is a simulation space where you do mention digital twin in that promo.
So the Health Prototyping Centre was set up by eHealth New South Wales Health Pathology, Health Share New South Wales, and Health Infrastructure. And there's a few drivers behind it. One of which was that those four entities were doing a lot of work that potentially impacted the others' operations. So, for instance, HealthShare were buying beds that had to be wheeled around facilities built by Health Infrastructure, and eHealth was providing software that would track where those beds actually were. So that's just a simple example of them all working together. But the result of that was that there was a lot of complex interdependencies. So they kind of felt maybe we need a space where we can, test how things will work as a whole, and then, that will inform our individual activities or designs or solutions that we develop for various types of problems. The second issue that was driving the setup of the facility was that certainly from a HF perspective, but this wasn't exclusive to HF, it was that there are a lot of instances where I'd really like to do simulation-based testing of various devices, equipment, but we couldn't really do so without getting full ethics approval at best, at which point we were effectively entering pilot, because the reality is of testing an intervention in health is it's quite risky, right? If I go, okay, we're going to try out this new defibrillator on a ward, and then they plug it in and they go to defibrillate someone and it doesn't turn on, that's a fatality, right? So, there's this high risk factor. So we actually felt we needed a space that we could do testing in without placing the general public at harm. And so it'd probably be, the early testing, and eventually you would take it to the clinic. By that stage, you'd want to be fairly confident that it's going to work. And then the last reason for the centre being set up was that we wanted a space that was, supported iterative design. So particularly with facility layouts, I can't really go down to, let's say, Liverpool Hospital and just smash a wall down because I want to see what happens if the room's a foot bigger. But actually that raises also, we really are interested in how to best utilise the spaces that we have across the state. So we basically set up this centre, and, you can kind of tell already there's a massive human-centred design, human factors driver behind why we would want a facility like this. In terms of, the establishment of the facility itself, it did take 18 months to get it from concept to actually, we had a semi-operational building. That included negotiating between the respective partners and getting agreement on what the facility would do and its budget and its ongoing support costs, and then the actual construction and fit out. But actually, 18 months was a fairly quick exercise to get it in place. But now I guess that the reward is we've got this facility in New South Wales that supports a different type of simulation work beyond the normal training-based applications. And there's actually a more design-oriented facility where people can come and interact with proposed interventions very early in the concept development phase, and without risking patients.
Yes, I have seen a couple of these smaller simulation labs in a couple of other Sydney hospitals.
Yeah.
And I was really interested to see that this was a large one. Are you getting good traction here? Are people using it?
Yeah, they are. So the actual performance target for the centre was that it would complete 10 design sprints, in effect projects within the first year. And actually they hit that target in 4 months. So the prospective partners were fairly pleased. Some of those projects were actually then implemented. And I say some because, one of the rationales driving what we were doing was that, we should create a space where we can take more risks. So not everything tested there should be successful. And to put this into a point of comparison, right, in government, just because the way things are funded, the tolerance for failure is very low, right? You invest $1 million and the public expect an outcome from that. So the decision-making is very conservative. If you looked at startups by comparison, investors in them will work to an assumption 80% of their investments will fail, right? And that the remaining 20% will be successful enough to justify the cost of the remaining 20%, which is, basically the complete opposite to the public service. So what we wanted to do was create a mechanism by which you could test things very low cost so that you could test out riskier proposals. I like to call them it might be a stupid idea or it might be genius, that sort of thing. We found that, we were actually surprised that some of the things were implemented very quickly, in fact, and that included even just basic things like there was a project where they started saying we have a valuable intellectual property and room data sheets in New South Wales and the Australian Health Facility Guidelines, but they're very difficult to read. So they remodeled them based on bank statements. They redesigned them. Not a very physical application of the centre, but still the service was the same. And the bodies responsible for managing those agreed, wow, this is a lot cleaner and easier to follow. We should implement this as soon as possible. So, in fact, as part of that, then they tested how would we actually transfer it over with as minimal human effort. So, so some good outcomes. There's some other examples. They're talking about whether they needed to rebuild a pathology lab or could they retrofit it. And so we used cardboard to demonstrate the layout. And full disclosure, that high-level use case we actually stole from a piece of work Airdrie at Sydney Trains did. So I can't take credit for that use of cardboard, but nonetheless, very effective and productive exercise. And actually, I think I'm hesitant to say how much it saved, but we felt it was probably at least a few $1 million through a week's work.
Tracy's cardboard work, Airdrie's cardboard work has been instrumental in a lot of mock-ups that I've done since I did a workshop with Airdrie a long time ago. So I completely understand. It changes the whole, it's a game changer, isn't it?
It is.
So how's the reception been from the people that are working in these spaces? Because not everybody in these spaces are HF people.
No, in fact, very few. So we had the staff, we had some professional designers working in the facility, and we had some HF people sitting on the ancillary as well, including myself. But I think the reception was very positive. And I think everyone gets that it's easier to provide feedback on something tangible than an idea like written down, right? So if you think about traditional project delivery under waterfall, for instance, the first time you really get hands-on feedback is when it's built, right, and all the budget's spent. Sometimes that makes perfect sense, like a train station, right? You can't build a train station and then go, it's not right, and demolish it. So people like myself and you will sit and review quite dull floor plan documents and try and identify the HF issues that might be present based on those diagrams. And I think we do a reasonable job. But it is a lot easier to realise the PowerPoints are in the wrong space when you need to plug something into the PowerPoint, right? It's just a fact. So I think lots of people, when they came down to the centre and saw us setting up a temporary GP waiting room, it immediately clicked why it would be useful to have a centre for this. So very, very positive. Clinicians were quite liked the concept as well when we brought them down, which was a big concern. How would our clinical workforce respond to it? But I think it was a more engaging way for them to participate in design processes than alternatives like sitting on a committee.
How do you channel the work, though, into that space? Are we expecting people in health just to know it's there and say, oh, hey, we'll come? Or are you able to encourage, or has there been an ability to regulate where this should be used?
Yeah, it is a big question, because we actually, the centre will by necessity need to work with commercial entities as well, partly because the 4 partners have existing projects, right? And so there is an issue around conflicts of interest and intellectual property. But the high-level objective was that we wanted proposals, that initial idea to really come from anywhere, right? Because a good dumb idea, right, is not going to come from the staff at the facility. Like, they're great at honing ideas, but what's going to really bring high value to the health system was someone in a clinical space saying, I have a problem with X, and it finds its way to the centre, and then it gets proper, a little bit of attention, and suddenly people realise there's actually a way of solving this problem, and it's actually a big problem, right? But the staff in the centre themselves, they're not necessarily going to know the problems. They're designers, not clinicians, and they're not, again, the human factors approach. They're not the humans, but they're not the human we're interested in, right? And so we actually, there is a website that you can go to, and there's contact information for the centre manager. And we were in the process, and admittedly I've since changed roles, but we were in the process of, establishing mechanisms for people to propose an idea to the prototyping centre for it to be reviewed. And we really were welcoming ideas from everyone, just noting that just because you provide an idea doesn't mean necessarily the centre's going to run with it. And there could be commercial reasons why the centre elects not to, right?
Okay. So the centre decides, obviously, what runs for those reasons.
Yeah, there is a steering committee. One of our principles. I mean, this is getting into boring detail of government, but government loves governance, right? Big shock. And but one of our key points was, given that the service model was a 1-week sprint as the default service, we sort of said the approval process shouldn't take longer than the work, right? Just seems sensible to me. So we were looking at how do we, instead of having it reviewed by committee in the first instance, actually set up an agreed process by which a committee can then post hoc review it and be satisfied that appropriate decision making had been made by the centre staff. So let them act autonomously, but with rules around guiding their decision making. And there was also a general position of permissiveness, which is, well, it's a weak investment, so we shouldn't knock things back too lightly. Right? We're not here to say no, we're actually here to go, okay, well, why don't we give that a crack and see how we go. Now, that said, we were monitoring that because the requests were starting to come in thick and fast as I left, and we knew that they would eventually exceed the operational capacity of the centre. But I'd have to check in with the people working there now to find out from them how bad is it now.
Okay, so let's move away from governance and I'm going to ask a question. Have you been involved in simulation? Because simulation's been around for a while. Have you been involved in clinical simulation?
I have. I actually, relatively early in my career, did a fair bit of work with the Kim Oates Simulation Hub at the Children's Hospital of Westmead. They were pretty. It was pretty good actually, because they invited us in to provide human factors and threat and error detection content in their standard what was, I think, called detect training, which was their rapid response training, but a form of CRM training, basically. So we provided the human factors content for that, and then I'd often participate in the simulation-based work. And actually, this brings me to a great bugbear that I just want to share with people who might be listening. Healthcare does non-technical skills training, okay? I know it doesn't look like it, but everyone in New South Wales does CRM training. That's actually a thing, and they've been doing it for about 20 years. They just don't call it CRM. They call it detect. And it has a lot of CRM content. And I actually have a lot of colleagues from the human factors space going, why aren't they doing CRM training? And I have to say, well, actually, they are. I don't know if they do it enough. I don't know if it's consistent with modern best practice. And I also don't know if it works. But that's not that they're not doing it.
Okay. So the acronym CRM stands for those that don't know?
Crew resource management, or sometimes crisis resource management, depending on the application.
Okay. Of course, we know that this is used in aviation as well as
yes, it is.
health.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very popular in aviation, but it's used in lots of sectors, and it's a good team training approach. But I think that the outcomes health are getting is not necessarily from a complete lack of doing that sort of training.
Okay.
The issue is probably a little bit more nuanced.
Okay. So in the time spent early on in simulation, maybe we could talk about what actually goes on for a clinical simulation. Just think of an example, something you've worked on, the kind of techniques that were used, outcomes.
Sure. So look, I have a personal preference regardless of sector around, scenario-based simulation training. I also, and I guess because I've generally been more involved in the conceptual design work, in projects, so, the design phase, I've actually tended to err towards high-level scenario setting, right? Because you could do very prescriptive simulations, but, I'm actually often curious about where people are going to get stuck. So I'm kind of trying to keep it a high level. Now that actually, I think, tends to work relatively well in some types of healthcare simulation, because in practice, healthcare is actually incredibly vague, right? Like, you're in an ED and you have 4 patients turn up, and you'll have all these standardised assessment tools to triage them, but there's still a lot of line calls required around that. So that's kind of setting at a high level my preferred approach, and then, observation and depending on the use case, sometimes I've used more structured approaches. I quite like Rona Flynn's behavioural markers work, partly because she translated them into versions applicable to certain types of healthcare roles. So it made it a bit easier for me to do my job. I don't like inventing frameworks, actually. I like stealing them. So she did the work for me, and then I replicated it in Australia. I guess the process is fairly similar. You'll develop a scenario with subject matter experts, and that might be based on me actually going doing field observations and or interviewing them. I will say developing up clinical simulations as a HF specialist is definitely harder than other sectors that I've worked in, because you do have to probably provide a fairly detailed patient history for the simulation to make any sense to the clinicians. And I don't think a HF person can really write that. You need a doctor to write it for you. So you're going to have a SME working closely with you to do that. So you develop up this scenario, usually accompanied by a more detailed patient history. And then there's a loose script. If depending on how fancy you're feeling, there might be behavioural indicators that you're looking at monitoring. And definitely if you're doing a more training-based application, that's a good idea if you're going to then provide feedback to the participants in the training. We'll run the training, the simulation, possibly with actors. Possibly Tom's the actor. I've played the patient many, many times.
And he's still alive.
He's still alive. And then we've and then there's the debrief, right? Now, sometimes if it's more of a design-oriented purpose, it's almost like an empirical study, and I've actually the indicators are performance targets, and we may have even had them run through the same scenario at a high level multiple times with different interventions, right, to see, well, how do they perform under different conditions. And so that, for instance, I've done that with software products. If they're using the old tooling, how well do they perform? And if they're using the new tooling, how well do they perform? At a high level, I don't think anything I've described would look particularly dissimilar to how you'd approach it in other sectors, though. You, Sharon, your experience, you might disagree. You might say, Tom, that does not sound like what I do.
Oh, no.
But I actually, it's pretty similar if I was doing a control room simulation, and I have, at a high level, it looks very similar. Right, you're going to think, but obviously the work tasks are very different. So that this, the scenario on a motorway might be there's been a road crash, and how's the team going to coordinate to get the traffic moving again? Whereas in the hospital, it could be there was a road crash and you've got 4 patients turn up. How are they going to prioritise and treat these 4 patients? And the complexities of the team dynamics in both of those are probably key points of consideration.
I'm really interested in the simulation space, but we've probably chatted about that a fair bit. So let's maybe just bounce and ask the question, what other projects have you worked on outside of health?
So outside of health, I've worked on WestConnect Stage 3A. So I did the human factors integration for that project. And so that was, I think I mentioned already, long tunnel design, control rooms, maintenance. I've worked on quite a few smaller rail projects, usually station upgrades being one. I did do a small piece of work on the Sydney Next Generation train fleet, though I think it's now fully in service. That's not current generation. But I got to do some work around that, which was good. And that was actually very specific. And I think this is the interesting thing with human factors, right? Sometimes the work is really specific. And so in that particular instance, they had a light to illuminate the steps that the drivers had to climb up when they got into the train in the yard at night. And there was a question about whether the luminance of that globe was sufficient. And it was causing all sorts of problems at the time because the luminance specification was based on a standard which assumed traditional light globes and LEDs were pretty new. They technically don't have the same luminance, but may have the same luminance depending on how you measure it. So very specific issue is, can these drivers see these steps, and then doing all the analysis around what's the actual luminance that's being radiated. And then the other really specific part on that project was looking at glare in the cabin, right? Because Sydney, urban planning nightmare that it is, does literally run east to west, as do the train lines, and which means the drivers are basically in the morning driving towards the sun, and in the afternoon also driving towards the sun. So we nailed that one. But that means that the glare is a massive issue, and the Eurocontrol standards, as it turns out, they're not so worried about that because in Europe, I guess the sun is softer. I don't know, but the Eurocontrol standards don't quite work on the human-machine interface because of the glare issue here. So, we had to do a lot of work to help them design it so that the contrast was sufficient for the drivers to be able to see the speed on a screen of the train.
Okay, how about glare so they can see out the window?
Oh, that's also an issue. And I mean, it never ceases to amaze me, but, the Sydney trains, they have these massive windows, right? And I don't know if you've ever had a Sydney Trains person on here. I'd love to hear their story on this because they might say, Tom, you've got it all wrong. But I don't think I've got it all wrong. These trains have these massive windows at the front. They look spectacular, but if you actually look when they're approaching the station, the driver basically drives it through a little slither because he's pulled the blind right down and he's sort of actually, they're not hunched over, but because we factor that in now, it's the cab design. Yep. But they do look through basically a little slither because sometimes the sun is just really harsh, particularly in summer. So lots of glare issues. But again, this is not my normal work, but it was a project I had to do because people being able to see things is part of the human factors scope of works, I guess. So, it's never a dull day, I guess.
No, it's not. So what's probably one of the most fun projects that you've worked on?
I mentioned it earlier, but there was something special about driving trains out into the Nullarbor.
Yes.
It was literally, we got on the train at 7 and then drove out to the Nullarbor for 7 hours and then caught a train back. So I had to get out in the middle of the desert and wait. And it was spectacular, right? And I had to do this a few times. And I had to do it in far north Queensland as well. And it's a very different experience, right? That I suppose you could have the same experience driving across the Nullarbor, but I feel like it's even more remote because it's not the roadway. There aren't other cars potentially coming 2 hours down the line. This train's the only train that night, and so it's a truly isolating experience. So that was pretty cool. I'm just trying to think of other things that I've done that I find very interesting. I've worked on a lot of higher profile incident investigations over the years as well. Some of them were absolutely fascinating because they were getting a lot of media attention as they were playing out, and that actually in practice the people behind them didn't really know why the incident had happened. And so, they'd be reporting on this and this happened, and you sort of sit there going, well, actually no one knows that happened or why that happened. And actually, to be honest with you, a lot of the time the reporting was human error caused X, and at least one of them there was no human. So I got called in because human error had been conjectured. I'm like, we sat down and this, so the computer then automatically said this. We're like, there was a human 15 years ago when this was programmed, yes, and I'm not sure it was just demonstrably a human error because I'm not sure this was the use case they were coding for, but nonetheless, here we are 15 years later. So, I do find those ones fascinating because I guess the public's immediate sense is not particularly aligned to what's actually happened with these incidents. And I think the reason that makes it interesting is I get this alternate perspective thrown in my face just by picking up the paper, right, which you don't actually necessarily get a whole lot of otherwise. You don't get to see the instinctual response necessarily.
Okay. How have HF tools or the way that we approach projects changed over the lifetime of your career, at least so far?
I'll speak about human-centred design first, right, because I think that the change there has been enormous, right? Because if we look at the history of human-centred design, it definitely came out of human factors, right, and then went into human-computer interaction, became user-centred design, and now, when I entered the space, it was just user-centred design and human-computer interaction, and it was very, static web content focused and desktop software. And now in 2023, we have the application of human-centred design by an incredible range of professions, from marketing to user experience to organisational design. And those applications have very little to do with each other other than that they, without necessarily realising it, think that human factors is amazing. And so, but the what has changed is those disciplines have actually brought their own spins on the work that we do. And some of those spins are pretty awesome, right? So when I started my career, it was very usability focused in the digital space. And it's shifted dramatically now to our primary purpose would be around concept development and ideation. And a lot of those practices came out of the creative industries, so the product design space. And then they've actually gone through a human-computer interaction and human-centered design lens. And actually, now I'm in a straight human factors engineering organisation now. And yet we still talk about things like maybe storyboarding is the best way to approach this. And, that's a method that was developed for cinema, right? And so, I try and think back noughties or the late 90s, and it just wouldn't have registered. right? We're still using Nielsen's 10 heuristics. So that's human-centered design specifically, but it's human factors. Just everyone else thinks we're great, right? And then other types of human factors practice, the rise of human factors integration. The term was definitely, I think, emerged as early as the 70s, but even within my career in Australia, human factors integration in rail has gone from, early works, and I could name drop some people I work with, but I don't want to give them too much of a big head. But they were doing early works as independent consultants and a few insiders in rail, and now you look at it and it's mandated, it's legally required, it's complex, it's just the done thing, right? It's as integrated as basic engineering processes. That to me is a massive change, and one I'm hoping we can push into health with as well. So, that approach existed, but it's gone from being this could be useful to this is actually minimum. This is the minimum expectation from the community, which is awesome. In terms of specific tools and techniques, I think a lot have been invented over my career, but the fundamentals of being able to do a good quality user research exercise, a good, robust, non-biased interview, designing a survey, these information collecting approaches, they're just as fundamental and critical as ever before. And actually, to be honest, I think probably will be more critical because I'm looking at things like ChatGPT and thinking, well, my analysis, my supposed brilliance is possibly going to be replaced by a machine. But the machine doesn't know what to enter into it in the first place. So my advantage is going to be my core skills around how I actually collect information in a way that doesn't inadvertently bias the outcome, right? So look, I don't know if that's what you're getting at with that question, but that's sort of what I think has changed over the last few years. It's probably lots more things. There's definitely more practitioners than there were when I started. And in fact, I'm kind of envious of our juniors now in that there are junior roles, because when I decided I wanted to go into the human factors space, I finished my master's degree, started applying for jobs and basically got told, so you need to go do a PhD. So I did. I was lucky that I could, right? But that was the reality, was either leave Australia or do a PhD. So I did the PhD. So I must have been fairly keen to get into the HF space, right? But that's completely changed. Not only can you come in now as a, junior with a bachelor degree from one of our core disciplines, but we want you to. We have jobs and opportunities and professional development pathways, and that didn't exist when I was young.
It's an area where we need to explore and make sure that we maintain those opportunities for education and growth in the field.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think the demand is, weirdly, and I'm actually also an organisational psychologist, and it's going through the same issue, which is supplies dropping, right? The unis are closing programs, but the demand for these services has gone up dramatically. And it makes no sense, right, what's happened, but here we are. It's nice for the privileged few, I guess, but it's not really. I hope that there's human factors practitioners when I'm, deep in the ground.
I think it'd be a terrible world without human factors practitioners.
I do think that I think that someone eventually is going to turn out the lights and the robots are going to do all work, right? That seems to be what we want as a society. I don't know how long it's going to take. I'm not going to put a time frame to it, but I think the idea is eventually automation and robots do all human work, and ideally we end up laying on the beach and drinking cocktails. But my theory is someone has to turn out the light, because the machines, they don't need the lights on anymore, right? So it's probably going to be a human factors practitioner, right? There's going to be a day when someone goes, well, we've offloaded the last aspect of human work onto the machine.
We're done.
I'm done. And then probably the last box on the checklist will be human factors practitioner takes off their suit.
During this podcast, Thomas Loveday has been talking about the Health Prototyping Centre and spatial digital twins. If you are interested in either of these topics, the links are available on our podcast website, which is hfehub.au. Thanks for joining us at the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia, where human-centred design really matters. If you like this podcast, make us your favourite in your podcast app. We look forward to chatting with you next time.